Cassette Communications Corporation is pleased to give you the following presentation from the IguanaCon, the 36th Annual World Science Fiction Convention held in Phoenix, Arizona from August 31st through September 4th, 1978.
Fandom meeting by saying I don't know what the hell I'm doing here.
But you're doing it very well.
And I think that we will probably start with questions from the audience since they've bound to know more about what I'm doing than I am.
No.
No good.
You will ask us. You will tell us what the question is. No comment.
What the hell are you all doing up here?
You know what the panel is. Read it, dummy. Read it.
Read it. Do you have it?
Come here, Schmendrick. For Christ's sake. Put your glasses up. You'll never see it. Fans into pros, the Futurium.
Oh.
That's Ted White. This is Richard Lupoff.
Hello, Mr. Lupoff. It's very nice.
How do you do? My pleasure.
Mr. White, it's been lovely. Thank you. All right. Okay, I don't know how many people out there pretend to write, draw pictures on the bathroom wall, but I know there's probably a lot of people out there that are interested in becoming pros sometime or other, and these people obviously have done it, or so the rumor says. So I think probably the best thing would be for me to, wish I was somewhere else. Who here has been a pro the longest? Because I honestly don't know. You?
Good question right
You? Okay.
Not by much, but...
Not by much. All right, Mr. Silverberg, when did you first really, or I assume we're assuming that becoming a pro means the first time you sold something. If there's any basis for professionalism, I guess it's money.
Quick. Figure that out all by yourself.
It's on my notes. The first time you sold something, Mr. Silverberg, did you feel like a pro? I mean, when the check came in the mail, did you suddenly say, well, I have made it?
Oh, yes, definitely. The first time I sold something was a short story called The Sacred River, I think, to a magazine called Different, which was in fact a poetry fanzine, and I got $5 for it. There were five $1951, which is like about 150 today. And I was, like 16, so $5 was like about 150 today. But no, I didn't feel very much like a pro.
You didn't show up at the next convention with a red badge.
I couldn't afford to go to the next convention on $5. The first real thing I sold, I think, was a short story called Gorgon Planet to a Scottish magazine called Nebula around 1953. And yes, I felt that I had ascended to the elite, that if I died right there, I had accomplished my life's purpose.
And in fact, he has.
Died?
Best thing he ever wrote. After nightfall, of course.
All right, the first thing you ever wrote, continuing on this theme, since it got me somewhere.
That was the first thing I ever sold. There was a good many things that I wrote before it.
Was it edited a great deal?
No, unfortunately, it was run exactly as I wrote it. They spelled my name right and everything.
God, it's marvelous.
I used to write as Bob Silverberg, by the way, the first 3 or 4 sales, because I was a fan, remember, and I was a fan as Bob Silverberg, and I wanted everybody in fandom to be absolutely sure that the guy they knew as Bob Silverberg was the very same one who had sold those stories. And after about 3 stories, another writer that I knew, a very dignified writer, said, you know, Bob is kind of an informal name for your professional byline. Why don't you work as Robert Silverberg? This very dignified colleague of mine was Randall Garrett. And I thought it over about 1/10 of a second and said, yeah, he's right, and that's why I use Robert to this day as my professional byline, although not, in fact, my name.
All right, let me move the conversation to the left of the table so I can look in a different direction.
I was one of them for a second.
Yeah, Harlan.
Yeah.
We work. Yeah, let's work.
Okay, that's good. Go ahead.
All right, let me take a thing. Well, as Bob has chronicled, my path to selling was a very strange one, filled with false starts. Many times I thought I had sold and deluded myself into believing I had sold, and a couple of times, the one time that I was supposed to have sold a story with a friend, we found out that we had been cruelly duped, and I had not in fact sold a story. When I finally did sell, it was by chance, and it was oddly enough not science fiction. It was I had done a thing on kid gangs, and the article was bought. It was originally called "I Ran with a Kid Gang," and it was bought by a magazine called Lowdown, which was one of the confidential Manqué magazines of the sleaziest, most schlockmeister sort. And they bought this thing and paid me not all that well, $25, $35, whatever the hell it was. And I was delighted to get it because I was in New York and destitute. And they never actually ran the article. They threw away the article, but they used the photo of me that they had taken and touched in a scar over on my face. Indeed, a scar. And it was a most insidious looking kind of Fu Manchu-like a photograph, which made me look like a desperado. I treasure it. And and they signed it with the name that I had in the gang, which was the pseudonym under which I ran in the gang. I mean, they really thought my name was Phil Beldone, and they called me Cheech in the gang. And so it was signed not by myself, but by one of the other, Phil quote Cheech unquote Beldone. And this article, which was absolutely and utterly bogus, but it was in fact my first sale.
I happened to be around the very day that Cheech Beldone thing connected, and I was walking down 114th Street towards Riverside Drive when I observed coming towards me an Ellison-shaped object that was pausing every 10 feet to levitate about 2 feet and twirl in a 360-degree circle, and then hit the pavement again and continue up the hill and leap and twirl again. As he passed me, I said, what has happened? He said, I've sold, and kept on going.
Listen, it was not so much the sales. I mean, I made my sales. My first sale, really, in this field was a little short story called Glowworm, which I sold to a marvelous, marvelous man who was out in California now named Larry Shaw. He's probably one of the best editors this field has ever known. He should be working as an editor in this field, and he isn't. And Larry bought the story from me, and as was the case with many editors in those days, we're talking now 1955, 56, something like that, Larry took me to dinner, and because we were both destitute, he took me to a Chinese restaurant on the Upper West Side, right near Columbia University, near West 114th Street, and I believe dinner for both of us ran $4. And I ate a lot because I was storing up, and he bought the story and he paid me a penny a word. And I think it was $30, $31, something like that. And that was nice. But the rejections were the best part, because the this is the God's truth, and Bob was living this, so he can attest to this. I mean, I tell these stories and people say, you're making them up, but as long as I have one witness who's alive who can testify to it, then I'm okay. I sent out a story to Manhunt magazine, which was the big market in those days. It was pocket-sized crime story magazine. And I mean, if you hit Manhunt, man, you were heavy duty. So I sent this story out in the morning. It came back in the afternoon mail. Am I lying or am I telling the truth?
Well, not only that, I can now finally tell you a little bit of inside stuff about another of your rejections.
Oh no, don't do this to me, man.
Oh, come on.
I was up at the Office of Amazing Stories, to which I was writing. I was selling stories to Howard Brown then. I came in one afternoon, and I saw Brown sealing an envelope and flipping it aside kind of contemptuously, and I said, "What's that?" And he said, "That's the story that Ellison is sending in tomorrow."
God, I'm tired.
Harlan's typewriter ribbon, right, was inked with 3-sublimated thiotymolene.
Is that how you pronounce it? I always thought it was thiotymolene.
Well,
I'll tell Isaac. How would he know?
Who's Dennis Jr.? Terry or Ted?
When do you date your first sale, Terry?
It's like date of rank. You ever see a bunch of second lieutenants together? When you get your commission, right? July 13th, 1977. Morning or afternoon?
Actually, Dick, I think it may be between you and me because I saw someplace recently where your first sale was 1960. Is that right? It was in print. It must have been true.
Depends on the kind of sale. You know, like lemon.
Oh, well, let's not go into what you were selling in 1960.
I didn't sell any science fiction until 66, and it was published in 67.
Okay, well, in terms of science fiction and fantasy, I do predate Ted, although Ted predates me with some other stuff. And if you really want to get technical about it, I sold a comic book that I drew when I was 7 or something like that for a nickel to my next-door neighbor. I'd like to have it back now for a dime. I sold my first story in 1961. It was about 1:32 p.m. I was
North side or south side of the hill?
It was what was the address, Ted? It was the Honor Hall in New York.
Oh, yes.
In Greenwich Village, in an office that Ted White was running at the time. I used the word running loosely. It didn't make a whole lot of money, and it folded after a while. But in the meantime, everybody he knew used to go down there and use all of his typewriters. It was a mimeograph shop, and had several typewriters going. I would go down there every day, having just moved to New York and decided to conquer the big city and make my mark upon the granite walls of the metropolis.
I like that.
You like that?
We'll give you 3 cents a word for that.
You don't have to. It's yours from 1958. It was in fantastic. And most of the people were just doing, fan stuff. So was I a lot of the time. But one particular day, Avram Davidson walked into the shop and said, "Hey gang, guess what just happened? I've just become the editor of fantasy and science fiction." Wow, that was incredible. And there were, maybe half a dozen of us around there then. Ted was there, and I was there, and I forget who else. And we all fell at his feet and groveled a lot, and we laughed at every one of his jokes, including the good ones. And he just, he took all this in and liked it a lot. And looked around and noticed that I was typing something that was double-spaced. So he drifted in my direction and said, "Is that, are you trying to write something that is not fan stuff?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm trying to write science fiction these days." He said, "Oh, well, do you have anything to show me?" And I said, "I happen to have here, as a matter of fact, now that you ask," and dragged out something that was on submission elsewhere. I had a carbon copy, and I handed it to him and said, "This is something that's, maybe I'll show it to you later." And he said, "Well, let me glance at it." And he walked off into the other room and came back 5 minutes later. It was a very short story, and said, "I like it, I'll buy it." And I fell off my chair. I'd gone back and written another half a sentence by that time. My God. And that was my first sale. It was a story eventually titled Who Sups with the Devil. Originally titled Some Words with the Devil, which was a kind of homage to Edgar Allan Poe. Avram, who doesn't know too much about literary stuff, didn't get it. So that's a lie, folks.
What?
He knows a whole lot. He just thought it was a lousy homage, I guess. He didn't want to mess up Edgar Allan Poe's memory. So he stuck this other title on it, which
Isn't
was
that what they
wonderful.
call lobsters in France?
Edgar Allan Poe?
Now, isn't that canard?
That's it. Well, basically true.
It's the bottom duck in one of those pyramids, isn't it? They built at the seaside? Base canard?
Exactly. What, the bottom duck?
Yeah, the bottom one. He's the base canard.
Are they on mic? You poor audience. Sorry about that.
We're doing this is the top stuff, friends. It's downhill from here.
Base canard is the linchpin of the dew line in northern Canada.
I thought it was the canard line.
Anyway, that
No. The canard line is the party line for the canards in southern France. We all know that.
I'm reminded that Pete Graham once wondered what would happen if the canard lines ever merged with Aer Lingus.
Laugh, they don't understand. It's wonderful.
Anyway, that was a 2,000-word story. I got paid $40 for it and blew it all on fixing a tooth for my wife. let's reconstruct that a moment. Where did we start? We got to cunnilingus, but how? The usual way. Canard.
With bestiality and work onward.
This conversation is degenerating, and I feel that I must bring it back to some sort of intellectual level. So why don't we... So in my usual fashion, let us swing to the far left. Mr. White, obviously you're the only one left.
No, I'm not. Dick's left, but he can wait a little longer.
I know, it's as if you heard it.
A couple of days ago, I was on Dick's panel and was never asked to speak at all, so Dick can wait a little while. Actually, Terry has a false memory there. I bought his first story, and it was fantasy. It was just never published. That's unfortunate, but it was the first time he got paid for fiction, right? It's called Blind Clarinet.
Oh, well, you weren't at the Separate Business meeting the other day where it was decided that a first sale actually is to be considered a first paid publication, and since that was never published, I don't count it. And besides, it wasn't science fiction or fantasy.
All right, it was fantasy. You're going to rule fantasy out
It was
from this
not
panel, huh?
fantasy. It was
Okay.
a straight story about a jazz musician. Come on, Ted, you bought it. Didn't you read it?
Arguing about the
Who has
story
tenure?
that did go to him. Right. 17 years ago.
Well, anyway.
It doesn't matter whether it's fantasy or science. We're talking about fans into pro. Pro is
Right.
someone who sells. Doesn't matter what he sells. Right?
Why are you picking on him?
That's why I claim I bought Terry Carr's first story, you see.
Kite?
Bag.
That was yesterday.
All finished? It was very hard for me to tell where my first sale was. Because, for instance, the first thing I had in the science fiction magazine wasn't fiction. It was in Fantastic Universe, and it was a con report, but I was paid for it. I was asked to write it and paid for it. But it didn't feel like I'd turned pro by back in the prozine. There was this piece by me with my name on it. So, you know, that was 1959. At the same general time, I was selling jazz writing outside the field, Metronome magazine primarily. Harlan got me sales with Rogue magazine a little while on, 61. That felt real good. That felt like a real professional sale, 5 cents a word. That always feels good, particularly in 1961. And if Frank Robinson is in this room, once again, I'd like to thank him for having edited that piece so well. Sold my first science fiction in 1962, and to this day, I don't know what my first sale was because they both occurred within a day of each other. One was a collaboration with Terry Carr, the other was a collaboration with Marion Bradley. They were both published within a day of each other in If and Amazing. But then people would say to me, that's not your sale, that's Terry Carr's sale, or that's Marion Bradley's sale, even though the stories were essentially mine. I'd first drafted them. So again, I didn't quite feel like I'd made the big transition into prodom. You know, it was a very gradual, ongoing, slipping in there thing. I'd been a fan for a long time. I knew most of the pros that I was dealing with professionally long before I was dealing with them professionally. People like Larry Shaw, for instance, or various other people that I dealt with early on, Avram Davidson, people like that. It just sort of, it seemed that I slipped into it without there being the sun came up one day and I was a pro.
Ted, were you living in New York when you slipped into it?
Yeah.
I've been coming to an insight here while we've been doing these little autobiographical things. We all lived in New York when we turned into pros. And none of us lives in New York now. Not one of us is there now.
Where you went.
It certainly was. That was the sense of the power center of it all. You went to New York to become a pro. I mean, you went to New York because that's where all the editors were then, that's where all the magazines were. And for instance, when Harlan was in New York in 61, I was following around editorial offices, and we were both extremely broke at that time, and we'd ride trucks up 6th Avenue and things like that.
Yeah. We'd grab onto the back end of this truck, zipping along the boulevard. We would literally grab onto the bar.
The whole thing is stuck out in back.
That you know, when they would push up the back like that, you know, and there was a handle on it to grab. We would grab onto that sucker, and there was a ledge about that big, and we were wearing suits, so we would look good when we got in the office. Here were these two suited guys And we didn't have the money for bus. Oh, it was terrible.
There was only 15 cents for the subway in those days. Well,
we'd never be writers.
in any case, at the same time that all this was going on, I was simultaneously becoming a professional editor. And I don't know whether we can include that within the purview of this panel, I suppose. I was up at Avram Davidson's when he was living in Milford.
That's the word you get 10 cents for, a purview.
And a friend of mine was there, and talk about fast rejections. He'd put a story in the mail to FNSF in Brooklyn one day and gotten it back the next. And he knew that Avram was not in Manhattan, and it would take a while for the story to leave the FNSF offices in Manhattan and go up to Milford, Pennsylvania, and be read by him and come back, and he did not see how it could be done in 24 hours. So he and I were visiting Avram, and he said, Avram, about this story I sent you. And Avram said, what story? I never saw it. And out of this conversation, it developed that at that point, FNSF had a very overeager slush pile reader whose attitude towards the whole thing was you picked up 100 manuscripts at the office and you riffled through them quickly, throwing in rejection slips, and you stuck them all in the mailbox that morning. And they had decided some point, not long before we were there, that this man was not to remain with the magazine. And Avram told us this, and essentially was saying, send your story in again, this time it'll get to me. And
Stanley Smith, that's all.
I don't know. I, in fact, never knew his name. I have the feeling he wasn't even in science fiction. He was just doing it as sort of a college thing or something. But I said to Avram, gee, you mean that the position is open? Little knowing what I was letting myself in for. And he said, yeah. And I said, do you think I'm qualified for it? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, what do you think? And he said, why don't you go and talk to Ed Furman, and I'll give him a call and tell him to hire you. And so I got my job as assistant editor of FNSF, which consisted of reading approximately 600 manuscripts every month. And if people want to know why I don't read slush for Amazing and Fantastic, find somebody else to do it for me. It's because for 5 years, folks, 600 manuscripts a month.
If people want to know why his sideburns are gray, 600 manuscripts?
I'm only 25 years old.
This business of instant rejection, we'll let Lupoff tell about how he lost his cherry too, but in Fred Pohl's memoir, The Way the Future Was, he talks about how he edited Galaxy. Every night when he went back on the train to Red Bank, New Jersey, his secretary would put rejection slips on all the manuscripts. He would take a bunch of manuscripts in their manila envelopes with a rejection slip clipped on it, and Fred would read them on the train. And if he found anything that was salvageable, he would put it in his briefcase. The rest he would mail at the end of the train ride. And they moved very fast that way.
Yeah, the trains have deteriorated a lot.
He had to throw away a lot of rejection slips for the ones he bought.
Mussolini, he was the last good one.
Good what?
I thought it was Horace Gold who made the trains run on time.
Horace Gold was not the last good Mussolini. I had one for breakfast. It was
I've never met a Mussolini I didn't like.
Well, okay.
Your turn, Mr. Lupoff.
Okay, I'm the new kid on the
I don't know,
block.
when the Marx Brothers did all this crap, they went out of their minds.
You're
Well-
sure about that?
Okay. See, it happens that we five guys are all pretty nearly the same age, and we were all fans at more or less the same time, basically the 1950s, and everybody got the idea in his head, oh, hey, I'm going to try that, and turn pro. And I got my first rejection slips around 1951. I got one from Anthony Boucher, and it was beautiful. The essence of it was, obviously you're not going to sell this story, but obviously you're just a little kid, and if you can actually type and you know enough to double space, keep at it. You'll get somewhere.
He was right.
Yes, sure.
You
That's right.
learned how
Double
to...
spacing, that was the key.
Yeah,
Double
the essence of the
spacing.
plot.
There you go,
That's
folks,
it.
the secret.
Lesson one. Lesson
Have
one.
margins.
Okay.
Did you ever discover single spacing?
What happens when you try that?
It's called the phasing.
You become Peter Benchley.
Peter Benchley.
What? Have you ever read that book? Your brain
What book?
runs out of your ears.
Okay, well, moving right along, yeah, all of these guys actually became pros, and I decided, they're poor and they have to ride on the backs of trucks on 6th Avenue, and who wants it? So I got a job in the computer business, right? And that's living in a penthouse and making a lot of money and wearing 3-piece suits and dining in fancy French restaurants and so on.
You.
Right? Yeah. Okay. And, years went by, and I realized that,
Not where it was at.
in all seriousness, unless you're thoroughly convinced of reincarnation, you better do what you really want to do, which was not be in the computer business. So, I realized that I had blown like 10 or 12 years when I should have been earning credentials and establishing myself. And my contemporaries, that is my birth certificate type contemporaries, were half a generation ahead of me professionally, and I had a lot of catching up to do. So I wrote a couple of chapters and a proposal for a novel and sent it off to a guy at Ace Books, a beginning editor named Terry Carr. And he kind of liked it and passed it along to his boss for approval to issue a contract, and the boss vetoed it.
I passed it along to my boss because I didn't want to personally reject something from Dick.
Yeah. Okay. I got a letter from Don Walheim, the essence of which was, well, it's more than the essence. This is just about verbatim. It says, Dear Dick, because Don knew me instead of Dear Mr. Lupoff, I've read your proposal, and I noticed that the hero of your novel is a Negro. And you may not be aware that most of the people who buy science fiction books are white. And most Negroes do not read anything, especially science fiction. So who's going to buy this book? So we're not going to publish it. Okay, I'm sorry to tell you that about Don Walheim, but it's God's honest truth.
We're being taped, Lord.
We are?
You bet you are.
It wasn't Don Walheim who said that. It was actually Aaron Wynn. Right.
Who's dead?
That's right, and libel law does not involve. Okay, so I sent the thing to Larry Shaw. Speaking of good people who gave us first sales, and Larry bought the thing, and I wrote the novel. It came out in 1967, and for the next 3 or 4 years, I wrote part-time, and since then I've been doing it full-time, and that's that.
I now have a crib sheet. Things should be easier. You all started as fans, okay?
We all wrote for each other's fancy.
Well, that's a concept I'm not 100% familiar with, so that's probably
Fanzines? Let's explain fanzine to her.
And there may very well be people out there that may not know what a fanzine is. Now, I have seen a few, but it's something I have no interest in, and maybe there are a couple, 3 to 1 person out there that doesn't really know what a fanzine
Why don't you stop?
is. There anybody out there that really doesn't know what a fanzine is, or the publication of a fanzine? You see, I told you.
Well, piss on him. There's 2 and there's 9.
Confess.
Him I believe.
All right.
I've seen his fancy.
All right, well, if everyone knows what they are, we can just flush over that. All right, did your writing for these fanzines and you're working for these fanzines as a fan, did it prepare you in specific ways for the assault on Protum? Ta-da. You're supposed to answer when I'm finished.
Intelligently phrased question.
Let's get down there.
Did writing as a fan, and from what I understand of the fanzine routine, it's like a lot of writing. It seems to be you putting this thing out on a fairly semi-regular basis. Did it really help you start preparing yourself as a pro? Did it give you any professionalism? Or did it just help you into turning out more stuff?
What's the difference between those?
Let me suggest just one thing here, that when you ask questions, you put at the end of the question a name, just anything from that list there, preferably this panel.
Have to do that. All right.
And then we won't all grab for the microphone.
Since you suggested it, you can start, Mr. Carr.
Well, I have the only other microphone, I may as well. What was the question? Oh, yes.
keep doing it in order of seniority. That way we know who we are.
Give that microphone to I know who I am.
Colonel Carr. Give it to General Silverberg.
All right. I became a pro so young that it's kind of hard to tell whether fandom had much influence. I was a fan from about the age of 12 to 18, and I've been a pro for the remaining 79 years. I did a lot of writing of all sorts. I wrote for my high school newspaper. I wrote for a fanzine that I published. I wrote for Harlan's fanzine. I don't think I ever wrote for Terry's fanzine. Dick hadn't even begun publishing a fanzine. He was in the Army. Yeah. I did a lot of fanzine...
I had an early one.
An early one, yeah. I did a lot of fanzine writing between the age of, say, 15 and 17. But I think it didn't help. What are they doing down there?
You can't take him. You can dress him up, but you can't take him.
I think what fanzine publishing did was simply to allow me to go to the convention and swagger around feeling I was one of the crowd and meet the editors and meet the fans and meet the pros and develop the kind of chutzpah, which is Greek for hybris, that allowed me to come in here at the age of 18 or 19 and say, what I publish you will pay for. And I've been doing that ever since.
Much as I hate to admit it, fanning prepared me, was directly responsible for my becoming a professional as a writer. I was into a lot of other different kinds of things, acting and singing and all sorts of other craziness. But I began as a fan in Cleveland and joined the Cleveland Science Fiction Society, was one of its founding members in '51. And then they had a kind of a club newsletter, which I, if I were reincarnated, it would be as a thick-ankled Yiddish woman organizing in the Catskills. I mean, that's what it would be. I immediately took this thing and said, well, I'll put out the...
You should only come back as Harlan Ellison.
God love you, you little Dickens. I took over this little magazine and ran it for a while as the bulletin of the Cleveland Science Fiction Society, and very shortly began using articles. I began writing to professionals, to editors mostly, and I remember the first thing I think was Ray Palmer, who was editing Other Worlds at the time, and got him to do a piece. And then I went to conventions. I met some of these people. And then I took the magazine over for myself. The club kind of fragmented, and the magazine went with me and became a thing called Dimensions. And I was what was called a Chicon fan. Now, the fans are very big on neologisms and acronyms and all those kind of words you can't pronounce. And a Chicon fan means a serious, constructive fan, as opposed to an asshole, I suppose. Terry, Bob was even more Chicon than I. I mean, Bob's fanzine reeked of pretension. I mean, it was just, it was really, it was well mimeographed and had right-hand margins. Had right-hand margins. Can you imagine justifying right-hand margins on mimeograph? Jesus,
There's no justification.
There is no justification.
You did it too.
Right.
You invented a different method of doing it.
But I did it eventually. Yes, I drifted. You get anal compulsive about these things, and if you listen to the names of the titles of the fanzines, you will understand how each of us became what we are today. Bob's fanzine was called Spaceship. My fanzine was called Dimensions. Terry's was, I can't remember, Terry, what was?
Many, yes.
Many. Now, what would give us a couple of the names?
Innuendo.
Vulcan was the first one.
Vulcan, Innuendo. What was yours?
Zero
with an X, and his was called Zip. And then he changed what we had of those. And the thing that I learned most from it was how to edit. And I kept trying to imitate the way that science fiction magazines looked and try, filling them up with things like coming attractions and announcements and letter columns and all that bullshit. So that years later, it has stood me in enormously good stead. I taught myself design and the value of art and the value of white space, and I've used that in helping to design almost all of my books in the last, 10 years. But the most important part about it was that it prepared me specifically by by getting me in with the people who were the professionals, by soliciting articles from Sprague de Camp and Fletcher Pratt and Algis Budrys and people like that, who were themselves, selling. I was able to worm my sleazy little way into Prodom as kind of a water boy, and so that when the time came, I had a group of people who were prepared to help me in some way. So yes, I was prepared in very specific ways for professionalism by fandom. It was a very different world then, however.
Yeah, I was definitely prepared for professional writing by fandom in many, many ways, most of which I won't bother telling you about, so sit down. It's okay. Of course, yeah, I got in touch with all sorts of people, writers and editors within the field and so on. Not because I was publishing the type of fanzine that Harlan is talking about, because I published mostly, well, let's say shortly before I became professional, I was publishing a fanzine called Fanac, which was the locus of its day. Except it was rather more heavy on the gossip side than Locus is. We didn't worry too much about lawsuits in those days. In fact, we made fun of them in inch-high headlines. There were things going on in fandom like lawsuits where $25,000 and so forth, and somebody would sue back for $50,000, and we finally ran a headline which simply said, "Can you top this?" and so on. And I was publishing other fanzines and writing tons of stuff for everybody who could find me. Writing about the things that were happening to me and my friends, preferably things that I thought were funny, or if they weren't, things that I could make funny. I usually tried to give the punchlines to somebody else, and if I had to make them up, I would do that too. Basically, they were true stories. But in the process of telling all of these anecdotes about what happened at the club meeting last night, or writing a convention report, and I ran into so-and-so in the hall, and this, that, and the next thing happened. Instead of just doing it formlessly, as so many people were doing, I learned that it worked much better if you maybe had a little structure to it and led up to a point, and it was about something. And after a while, I began to realize, gee, this is kind of what you do in fiction, isn't it? Because I had been writing fiction aimed at the New Yorker and things like that at the time. And realized eventually that what I was doing was learning while I didn't earn. I wasn't getting paid for any of these things, but I was learning how to write stuff, and I was developing some facility with the language, all of that. The basic thing in terms of getting in touch with the professional editors and so on that happened was that Don Wilhelm, about whom this will be a positive story, read some of my stuff in fanzines, and evidently liked it. In fact, he even said so in print. He cannot deny it. And when I went to New York, I sent my first novel off to Don Wilhelm. The first novel was first novels, they're about sensitive young men who are learning about the cosmic beauty of love, which means sex.
Can I inject one footnote that they will find interesting?
You always put your foot in, Harlan. Go ahead.
Unless I'm sadly mistook, Terry's first novel and Ted's first novel appeared simultaneously as the alternate halves of an ace double novel.
No, I wasn't.
You were dead wrong.
Weren't you Android and Avenger?
Yeah, but that was backed by John Brunner.
Oh.
Terry's a couple years earlier.
Fuck.
You'll never make Sam Moskowitz, Harlan. I mean, you'll never become Sam Moskowitz, excuse me.
Quel fromage. No.
Do not start that stuff again. God knows where we'd end up on the next series.
This is duller than shit. This is dull. Why don't we just have a riot?
In any case,
Why don't we get to me?
I sent my sensitive novel about young love to Don Wilhelm, who sent it back to me instantly and said, "We don't publish sex books around here." And that killed me, because I knew they did, for one thing. Or tried to. And he called me into the office, and he said, listen, I've read your stuff, kid, and why don't you do something sensible like writing science fiction, which is what you've read, I know. And I thought, that's far out. Why don't I write what I know? Yeah, okay. So I began doing that. Dick?
Yeah, write about, write what about, other galaxies, other planets.
Write about what you've read about. I think that there's no question that fandom did everything for me that it did for the other people here. So I'm not going to duplicate what they said. It seems to me there's some other things that they didn't say. One of them was, and it's a much overlooked fact, is learning how to type. Now this will sound sort of rudimentary and obvious, but I don't mean learning how to physically operate a typewriter. I mean learning how to sit in front of a typewriter, think a thought, and have it come out of the typewriter on paper as a coherent sentence or paragraph or something. And this is
never understood how that's
not anymore. This is a facility that you pick up by grinding out reams of fan writing. And one of the things that was very popular in the late 50s in fan writing was to write on stencil, which is effective.
No, that's Stendhal. Stendhal. We've all written on Stendhal. Forget it.
Maybe you're right, Harlan. A riot would be appropriate.
First North American serial riot only.
I can't bottom that. At any rate.
Oh, they're leaving already. Cowards. Chicken shit. Get on there. Sit down.
Please give your names as you leave the auditorium.
Guards, arrest those two men. And that woman, too. And her mother and all her children.
At any rate, it's a very obvious but overlooked thing, which is gaining technical facility to express yourself. And it's the easiest place to pick it up is writing for fanzines, and basically by writing a lot. And we did write a lot. When Terry came to New York and we had Honor Hall and we were putting out fanzines at such a fantastic rate, it was unbelievable. Everybody was publishing a fanzine for everybody else, and we were all writing for each other. Plus, we were all co-editing another fanzine called Void. Now Void is an Australian prozine. Before that, I put out a fanzine called Stellar. Now that's a paperback collection from Del Rey. I don't know. I should have copyrighted the titles or something. Universe used to be a fanzine published by Ray Nelson. Right. But another point is that I did not set out as a fan to write imitation pro-fiction. Now, that's a big thing these days, is fanzines filled with imitation pro-fiction by people who aren't good enough to be in prozines. And I've always thought that was not the right way to do it if you were using fandom as a stepping stone to prodom, which all of us did whether we knew we were doing it or not. I think that it's far more important to learn how to manipulate the tools before you set out to make something with them.
Right, Ted. No wonder you have to wear glasses. You gotta have a better... You always get upset when we do this. You gotta get with it, either that or we're gonna look like monsters beating you up. And it happens every goddamn time.
Beat me hard.
It's been going on for 25 years, for Christ's sake. Oh, well.
Oh, look. All right. I did the same stuff later than they did it. That's all. But, look, I want to say two things, and then I think, we ought to, I hope maybe we can, let those, let them ask questions, because I see,
we ought to make nice to Ted.
yeah, right. We all really love you, Ted, right? Harlan, say it.
No, man, he always does. He always whips that kind of crazy guilt on us. I mean, he sits there, sits here with a sign. Kick me, come on, hit me, kick me. I mean, it's a bullshit panel. It's a bullshit panel. And he goes, well, we became terrific human beings because we had Gestetner ink under our finger. The bullshit, man. We stole, lied, cheated.
Why didn't you pull that crap on Terry, huh? Why'd you let him talk?
Oh, he's a bore, for Christ's
He cries, man. He cries, you know. Go home and do it to his cat again.
You know, if we're going to do this on a seniority basis, Dick doesn't get to say anything. I get to say very little. Terry gets to say a little bit. You and Bob say it all. Go ahead.
Oh, well.